So Peter Hirshberg is the co-founder of the Conversation Group, a fast-growing consultancy helping brands and companies in the world of a digital empowered audience. And Peter has been for a long time at the cutting edge, may I say, of the digital world. You have been with Apple, iconic company. You have been with Microsoft, another iconic company, with NBC. You branched out into luxury online retail with Estee Lauder, very successfully. And you lately, Peter, engaged into Technorati, one of the big pioneers of social media, and still a board member and was chairman, or still German, I think, yes. So, you know, he's really at the cutting edge. And something else I want to say, you're also an intellectual of the web, may I say so. You're a thinker. And why? Because you go to MIT, we had a chance to listen to one of your lectures lately. And last thing people should know, you're a wonderful storyteller. Whoever listened to something Peter did, it's humor, it's witty, and it's all that. And that's why we said you should be the moderator and introducer to Tim Kring, another grand storyteller of our times. Tim is the creator and producer of Heroes. Who knows Heroes? A lot. Actually, also here you have a big audience and fan community. An Emmy Award series, television series, with a huge audience and fanship. And you really work also on the digital side to create this audience. And I stop now because it's up to you. We are very happy having you here. Another applause for these two creative men.
So welcome to DLD in Germany, Tim.
Thank you, everybody.
We first met a year ago and have actually been doing what we call the Transmedia Dog and Pony Show in several locations, several Yossi Vardy conferences over the last year. And what's interesting is how much this medium has changed. You know, there's all this talk today about disruption. No one's at the lead of figuring out how do you change TV, not just distribution, but the way you tell a story than Tim. And so I think we should start by talking about, before Heroes even started, there was this notion of transmedia, the idea that stories could jump from one medium to another, and this goes back a couple generations. So let's set the stage.
Well, is this on? Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. You know, one of the things that we talk about in transmedia is the whole idea of telling story across multiple platforms. And it seems that I was not the one to invent this, nor was Henry Jenkins. It was actually George Lucas who came up with this idea, whether it was on purpose or not, in 1978.
In fact, the idea of transmedia popped out on November 17, 1978, at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 Central in the United States. That was the time when there was a Star Wars TV special. Now, this show is widely regarded as one of the worst television specials of all times. Except something happened. A new character showed up in the middle of this show, and all of the fans went nuts. They're like, who is this guy? And it created such lust and demand for the character that storytellers started realizing something was new. Here's that scene, and what character should be on the lookout for, Tim?
Is a character by the name of Boba Fett.
What is it, Mr. Luke? I'm not sure. You saved my life. Thank you.
You are alone?
I have 2 droids. We've come in search of a ship that crashed near here.
Maybe I can help you. I am Boba Fett. The ship you seek is nearby.
Now, what happened when that came out?
You know, the interesting thing is that this not only showed up here, but shortly after that, Boba Fett showed up as an action figure in the stores for fans to buy. And not only did they show up alongside of Han Solo and Luke Skywalker and all of your favorite characters, but it showed up in a limited edition, which made it even more desirable. And so all of these fans around the world were thrilled and confused at the same time about who this character was. And sure enough, a year or so later, when The Empire Strikes Back came out and Boba Fett becomes a character, you had hundreds of thousands of fans who had already known who this character was. So it was the first real example of creating a character on one platform and then having it sort of migrate over to the mothership of the property.
1978. Now let's set that aside. And another thing went on right around the same time. In 1977 in America, the promise of interactive TV was delivered, something called Cube from Warner Communications. Both of these ideas went into remission for many years. And now let's turn back to Heroes. Now, you're telling this story in many forms, online, on television, in comic books, and characters kind of go back and forth. So
Right.
set the stage here.
Well, first of all, just to sort of set it up a little bit more, the idea of Heroes is that we have this large canon or mythology to the show. And the fact that it is big and deep and able to have multiple storylines allowed us to be able to tell story across multiple platforms like the internet and mobile, and we started off with the simple idea of creating an online graphic novel so that you would follow the extended stories each week with each episode. So this particular character, Wireless, Hannah Gittleman, started in one of those online comic books. And so the fans got to know her as a character only in the comic books for about, I guess, about 3 months before she showed up on the show.
And so here she is in the comics, and now this character makes her first appearance on television in this manner.
My name is Hannah Gittleman.
How the hell did you do that?
Satellite signals, Wi-Fi, radio waves. Your computer can download them, and so can I.
So you can access the internet without a computer. Just pull email out of your head.
We should say something about your audience, which is the most downloady audience there is. They're in conversation a great deal. It's a different flavor of audience, and one of the reasons you're doing this is to keep up with your audience. So talk a little bit about that bit.
Well, you know, the audience that watches Heroes is a very tech-savvy, generally a younger audience. And they're the very audience that has figured out how to find the show on other platforms. So, for example, Heroes was last year the #1 downloaded show in the world. Most of that was illegal downloads. And while that is a complicated fact for us as a commercial entity, the truth is you can't really ignore that audience. That audience who is able to go out and willing to go out and find the show and pirate the show is an important audience and one that's worth telling story to. And by having a large enough and deep enough well to dive into, we're able to allow the fans to immerse themselves in the sort of a greater understanding of this show that they love. An example of that is, are we ready?
Yeah, let's go do it.
Yeah. An example of that was we decided that we wanted to create a sort of database of people who were watching the show that we could then reach in other ways on SMS and in their email boxes. And so what we did was we created on the show, we had our main kind of villain, a guy who wears horn-rimmed glasses and works for a paper company that's really the front for all these nefarious activities that he does. He shows his business card to somebody, and we held on the card for maybe a second longer in the insert of the card. We held for maybe a second longer than you normally would. And within 24 hours, first of all, that business card had a simple web address on it. Within 24 hours, we had 600,000 unique hits to the website that we created, and I'll show you that scene.
Contact me when you change your mind.
The access number's on the back.
Now, we should point out that the show has a lot of fun with people. For example, it then sent them to a website that may be one of the worst-looking websites of all, but that made it that much more authentic.
Yeah, the idea was to create a website that looked like, you know, something that some cheesy paper factory somewhere would come up with. And as you dug around in this website and surfed around, you began to notice that you could take an employment test to see if you had what it takes to work for Primatech Paper in Odessa, Texas. As you answered these strange questions, you then began to realize that they were asking you whether you had special powers. And in order to fill this thing out, you had to give your text information, your email information, and we then had a database of people that we could then extend story to in other ways.
You know, there was an interesting set of circumstances. You're doing this at NBC a few years ago. They were experimental, and in the writer's room, in addition to having traditional writers, you must have had a team that followed the canon and in real time could evolve this thing to keep up with the audience.
Yeah, the whole idea of creating this material is to have a very short distance between the writer's room and the people who are making all of this content. Basically because there is a thin thread of authenticity that the audience understands, and that thread can be severed very easily if you betray them in some way, if they feel that it somehow is not authentic to the actual material.
Now, you know, we live in a moment of disruption, as the last panel talked about, and there's a lot of lamenting of television. Here's the core audience in their 20s and 30s, likely to leave, but by throwing in a lot of the DNA of gaming, you start to get them back. And it has interesting implications for advertisers, because advertisers can be written into all of this. Here's a clip of a promo that NBC did in which they start to tell traditional media companies and agencies what's going on here.
The two-screen experience also allows users to interact with the show during broadcast and test their knowledge against the online community with polls and trivia. Fans are invited to submit their own artwork to the online art gallery and create their own video mashups. The online audience pitched in to create and choose their very own hero, slated to appear in original online webisodes. Heroes, widgets, and embedded news updates are now available for users to personalize their own websites, blogs.
Well, we can tell you the announcer continued to promote this as a really good idea. And we'll continue on this. So here's a little summary of all of the different ways you're engaging with the audience.
Yeah, we created an entire world of ways to reach out across all these multiple platforms. And again, this is a way to extend the brand to mobile and to online, even to merchandising. And so this was a plan devised by the NBC Universal Marketing Division and Digital Division, primarily to promote and market the show. There was really no thought other than to gain more eyeballs to the show.
So what we're going to turn to in a minute is, having built all this, what's next? We're going to see if this next clip works. This whole idea that if you give the audience something to do, they'll respond differently, I think was first discovered by the great media theoretician Marshall McLuhan, who in the 60s was talking about the quiz shows in the 50s. I'm just going to go on from here. Your experience with Heroes actually raises a lot of questions. So here's the first one. The show is all about getting superheroes to go solve problems, and you've mobilized your whole audience to be able to do things. And one of the questions is, once they're mobilized, what do they do? And then another question is it's almost a two-way street, but they're not really influencing the story.
Right.
You're giving them content offline. So talk to me about, having done this, how you've become restless again and are looking at something new.
No, well, you're right. This idea of a two-way street, we had traditionally thought of narrative or content in a one-way street. We created it, we pushed it out there, and we hoped that people watched it. The only way that we understood whether they enjoyed it or not, or whether it was the Nielsen ratings. We now live in a world, obviously, that's a complete two-way street between us and the audience, and so a dialogue has been formed, and we now have an obligation to that audience to create content that they can now push back on. And while Heroes, for me, it was not simply about creating this massive, sort of large-scale, large in scope production. For me personally, I was very interested in telling a story about interconnectivity and about global consciousness and about saving the world. And I talked a lot about it in the show. And so every year we had our characters, in a fictitious way, go out and save the world. And I started to think that I had an obligation to these fans that had connected to the message of this show, that had connected to this idea of saving the world, that I had an obligation to try to figure out how to take people who were committed to that message and put them in a real-life situation where they would be able to immerse themselves in a narrative that would allow them to do good and to become a part of a movement for good.
So several months ago, you told me about a project that you're doing with Nokia, which we'll look at in a moment, which plays out not on television, but in real time in a mobile environment, and that mobilizes its audience. Let's talk a little bit about that audience. Here's some slides from the Kaiser Family Foundation study on media. 4 years ago, they discovered that kids were on either television or the internet or cell phones 8 hours a day. It's up to 10 hours and 45 minutes. And one of the fascinating things about watching TV...
This was a study that just came out this
week.
Yeah.
This week it came out. And if you delve into it, you realize that the actual time watching live TV is down, not just because of time shifting, but because people are on cell phones, they're in social networks. In fact, you can pretty much assume you don't watch TV solo anymore. I think there are two things I learned from this. The first is offline is over. There really is no longer offline if you're a kid. You're connected all the time. And if you're watching TV, you're always distracted. There's another screen.
Right.
And traditionally, programmers think, well, this sucks because they're not paying attention to me. And it's almost like if you're not programming for that second screen to involve them, it's like missing a big opportunity for the advertiser, for story, for engagement.
Right. Yeah, and this idea of it's a very simple idea. It's not a very complex idea for someone like me who's a storyteller. When people start to go in different places for their content, the idea is very simple. You want to fish where the fish are, and you want to send story across multiple platforms to wherever they are.
So let's talk about that. Traditional storytelling built for television. You're now coming up with a story or a canon and building for multiple environments.
Yeah, the idea is you place the story in the center, and rather than a television show in the center, the way Heroes was created as a television show, it was not created as a transmedia property. It was a marketing attempt to reach people through multiple platforms. The new idea is to put the story at the center, and if it happens to launch as a television show, then fine. It may launch as a multi-user online game or as an alternate reality game, so you let the content, the form, and the function follow one another.
So talk to us about what's about to happen in London, and tease this next story of yours that happens not on the air, but in space.
But in space, exactly. The idea, again, was to, since I had, as I said, created this sense of heroes solving fictitious problems in the world, the idea was to then take people and put them into a real-life situation, to create an immersive environment, an immersive narrative that people could slot themselves into. In this case, it's a conspiracy for good that you will slot yourself into and become a part of. London becomes the backdrop or the playing field, and your mobile device becomes your content and your consumption device, both the creator and the consumption device, allowing you to interact in a physical space with a narrative. You'll interact with actors, you'll interact with physical spaces where clues are left and where videos are left. You'll create videos, you'll help interact with the story, all in the effort to create a movement or a community that will do good. And ultimately, this will have a real-life, real-world, philanthropic implication. It'll have an ending that actually does good in the world, and while doing that, creates this community that can then create user-generated causes themselves and carry it forward.
I want to deconstruct a couple of things that are going on. So the first is, you've invented new forms of storytelling, just as D.W. Griffith figured out of new forms of video. So one is geotagging, the ability to find something and tag it and share that object is a big part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea that you are playing this and playing along and playing this role in physical space, using clues from your environment to pick up clues to where the story goes, to see video of what's happened in the story, to leave video for the next person to find it. So you're constantly interacting with the physical space.
Here's another one. Let's say Jarvis and I are both part of the secret society. If we pass each other in the street, our phones will jiggle, telling us to go find one another. Now, this is an interesting form of storytelling, but for advertisers it's interesting because you're engaged in something over time. And the nonprofit part I find interesting. When you think about how does a nonprofit engage its audience, well, the most sophisticated stuff is please send us money using text, like the recent Haiti issue, or with Facebook causes. But here, you've got a whole group of people, and if you build that nonprofit into the story, they're sharing, they're talking about it. It's a richer way to integrate marketing and cause in a new environment.
Right, and people are becoming a part of the cause themselves by creating this movement. It's basically what we're calling social benefit storytelling.
So let's wrap up and talk a little bit about kind of what's happening to television. I've been working on a project with a company called Active Video where we've been building out the ability to provide all sorts of capabilities on the screen, and our normal thoughts are better program bites, better content, and yet we realize if we know what channel you're watching and what your friends are watching, if we could mash up the social graph, what you're watching, what people are talking about, you could simply be watching TV and have a flash mob go on.
Right.
Or you could be watching TV and vote and have capabilities like that. So my question is, as a storyteller, as we build these APIs out, as you basically can take real-time knowledge of your audience, how does that affect telling a story?
Well, I think you've created a community that then can participate immediately with you, can go out and create content and feed it back to you, and create this sort of virtuous cycle.
And I think, so often when we think about the disruptive issues in television, we're focused on the transportation model. Will a new startup displace the cable company? Will it be IP or set-top box? And what we miss is that the design of TV itself, the ability to play with it, interact, all the metadata that comes around it, gives a lot of new leads on life and also interesting business model implications. And let's wrap up on that. You learned something really interesting about your Heroes audience and Facebook.
Yeah, it was actually a few months ago. I found something out that I didn't know existed, nor did NBC Universal, who makes this show. There was actually a Facebook social game created by a couple of guys that took, I think, a couple hours to produce and a couple $100 to make. That basically made over $1 million a month for 10 months until it disbanded. When I heard about this, I immediately thought, well, what would have happened had the creator of that show been able to sanction this material and the marketing, sort of giant marketing machine behind NBC Universal had been behind it. Clearly, there is a way now to monetize this transmedia back end that we did on Heroes purely for promotion and marketing. And so I started to think that perhaps there was a bridge between traditional model of creating content and a new and next generation storytelling that has the ability to monetize itself.
What's interesting is we hadn't talked in a while. I was off working on all of this stuff on how can you pull stuff from TV and build new capabilities with story. You went off and looked at this and actually decided there was a new company to be built. So
Yeah.
we should talk a bit about that, because you got me so excited about that that we're off taking a look at something here. So tell us about Imperative.
Imperative is a new company that is in the absolute nascent stages at this point. Me and a couple of friends and a few laptops at this point. But the whole idea, again, is to bridge this gap between traditional storytelling and next-generation storytelling by taking a holistic approach to content and thinking about the idea of placing an idea in the center and figuring out where we launch it. It might start off as a social game on Facebook, then become a television show. It could start off as a graphic novel and then become an alternate reality game that then leads into a multi-user online game that then leads into a television show. But the idea of a kind of evolutionary imperative that someone is going to figure this out and bridge this gap, and I figure it might as well be made.
And you're being modest because you already have a studio looking at about 12 episodes of doing both.
Yes, exactly. And the idea is creating a transmedia backend that we can share in the revenue of and build some of these ideas of social gaming and online gaming.
Tim, thanks. We're wrapping up now, and what I want to leave you with is this belief that there's really a very hopeful future here for business models, for audience engagement. It's not so much lamenting television, it's just lamenting that we might not be changing it fast enough and keeping up. And I think this next year we'll see a tremendous amount of innovation as we take the DNA of mobile, of gaming, of online currency and see something new show up.
Right, and what I'm most excited about is still the ability to reach people and to create archetypal narrative that does something good in the world, that brings a positive change in the world. And it's something that I'm committed to continuing.
Thanks for joining us at DLD.
Yes. Good.